Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Baroud, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Michael Horn, thought leader and author of several books, as well as the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation.
I got started in the field of education by mistake, to be totally honest. I had a public policy and writing background, went to Harvard Business School to try to escape both, and I failed. I took Clay Christensen's class on disruptive innovation and building sustainable organizations was really his focus. That would be impervious to disruption. And it just blew me away, totally changed how I saw the world. And literally one day in November, he was teaching, and at the very end of class, he said, "Anyone interested in writing a book with me about public K-12 education, stop by." And I happened to stop by, not even to talk about that opportunity, to talk about my paper I was writing for the class. And at the very end, I said, I have a public policy background. I have family that works at the Department of Education. Like, I know a lot about this. Did you really mean co-author? And he said, well, yes. And he thought about it and prayed on it. And 3 or 4 months later, he signed me up. And the original plan was write the book. It'll be out in a year or so, and then I'll go do whatever I wanted to do. Well, the book took 2 years to write. And midway through, he and I co-founded the Clayton Christensen Institute, a nonprofit think tank, to further the research on applying these ideas of disruptive innovation, not only in education, but also healthcare, and now global prosperity, and a bunch of other practices. So I ran the education practice there for about a decade. And then I stepped aside in 2015, toward the end of 2015, and started to work in the gig economy a little bit, advised a bunch of organizations, spent a lot of time helping set up the Robin Hood Learning and Tech Fund, which is a nonprofit foundation in New York City. That was about a year project. And then I spent a lot of time with Entangled Ventures, which was an education studio incubating and building our own education for-profits and nonprofits and consulting to higher ed institutions. And through it all, kept writing about the future of education. So I'm now, I think, on book number 6 or 7 on education, and just recently stepped aside from a bigger role at Guild Education just to really go full bore on this question of how do we create a better conversation around creating a learner-centered future that allows every single individual to build their passions and fulfill their human potential. And that's what I'm passionate about, whether it's K-12 education, whether it's higher education, whether it's workforce learning, really that K through gray arc. I want to build a better world in which individuals all have that opportunity to fulfill their human potential.
Got it. And tell us about that. You just said K through gray. I've never heard that. Explain that.
Yeah, it's partially I'm taking it because it's the title of my new course that I'll be teaching at Harvard actually in the fall. But the notion is, kindergarten all the way through lifelong learning, right? When we gray and lose our hair and so forth, that we still need to be upskilling and reskilling and learning new things to be effective in the economy, to be effective citizens, frankly, to be informed citizens. You can't just rest. This is a world in which learning happens constantly and always, and individuals always need these opportunities. So I'm passionate about that. I leave out the pre-K through gray, not because I don't think those years are incredibly important. They are. It's just I haven't dabbled my toe in it yet. I have some opinions, but not solutions, I guess is what I would say. So I really focus on once you hit kindergarten all the way through, in my mind, we ought to be helping individuals realize mastery, figure out their strengths, what do they want to lean in on, and really be able to follow those pathways.
Got it. Okay, so you spoke about your career. You have written several books, and we'll get into at least the latest one a little later on. But how many books have you written so far?
I think it's 7. I was trying to think of this as I just said it. I mean, I can quickly rattle them off. It was Disrupting Class is the first. Then I edited a volume, Private Enterprise and Public Education. Blended was the next book. And then the Blended Workbook. And then choosing college was the 2019 contribution. Then my wife and I did a kid's story, Goodnight Box. And then my next book comes out in a few weeks called From Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Student, which is focused on K-12 schools. What do they rebuild out of the devastation of the last few years of the pandemic?
Got it. So let's talk about the pandemic, right? Now, let's talk first pre-pandemic, right? There were trends in place, and then the pandemic comes, we could talk about that, and then we'll talk about post. So go ahead, give us sort of your perspective.
Yeah, so pre-pandemic, and let's talk higher ed, right? Given the audience here. It was unquestionably true that there were already declines in enrollment in the post-secondary sector that had been going on really since the rebound out of the Great Recession. We had seen fewer and fewer students going back to colleges. But simultaneously, we saw a couple interesting trends. One, online learning was continuing to grow even as post-secondary enrollment was declining. So students choosing to get the majority of their education or significant parts of it through fully online classes was becoming a bigger and bigger share of post-secondary education. That was in the accredited world. You then also had the unaccredited world of post-secondary education and training, coding boot camps, massive open online courses from entities like Coursera, and micro bachelors or micro masters from edX and platforms like that. All of these things that were popping up that we didn't count in these enrollment numbers, but more and more individuals learning online and in what I would sort of more broadly characterize as faster, cheaper programs that more quickly got them the skills that they needed on demand to help them take that next step on their career journey, to take that next step within their current job, perhaps, to help them transition to a totally different field in some cases, or frankly, lifelong learning, right? Just things that they were interested in to extend themselves as human beings. A lot more of those opportunities have been bubbling and booming prior to the pandemic. And I think the last piece of this was before we even talk about the demographic declines that were on the horizon. We knew starting 2025, the number of 18-year-old high school graduates was going to start to soften, particularly in the Northeast, particularly in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, places like that. And we knew that there was going to be a hollowing out, and a lot of colleges were already having financial pressures. We expected it to get a lot worse given all of those forces starting in 2025.
Got it. And then the pandemic hit, and talk to us about how the sector has weathered it and are weathering it.
Yeah, well, it's funny, right? Because you can't say the pandemic's over yet still, even though it's a different phase, unquestionably. But, I think if we look back 100 years from now, we're going to say, holy cow, thank goodness for technology and online learning, because the way colleges and universities on a dime, really, I mean, basically they were in spring break, and then within 2 weeks, everything was online, was just incredible. And thank goodness the pandemic arrived when it did, because if it had been 20 years earlier, we could not have done what we just did. And I think we will step back and be like, wow, as a sector, that was incredible. And we will appreciate it more so for what it was. And it's also the case that as most institutions moved what in many cases were not great teaching and learning experiences online, they did so with a lot of clunkiness around Zoom and conference platform that is not built for teaching and learning. And there were a lot of students who were not tremendously satisfied with the experience, and they were missing the community, and they felt like, I'd been paying for the brick and mortar experience. How are you still charging me full freight? And by the way, it's very expensive full freight. It's been going up over year. And I'm not getting this sort of transformational experience more broadly, right? That I thought I would be getting at college. And so I think you have these two narratives that are simultaneously true, where wow for online, and it continued to grow. And by the way, there's a bunch of people who discovered online and they went to institutions like Southern New Hampshire University or Arizona State University or Western Governors University that did online well before the pandemic. And they were like, wow, I'm not going back. to brick and mortar, right? There were a bunch of gains from those institutions and others like them. And I think they will hold on to large percentages of those gains that they had. Southern New Hampshire, I think it's like 180,000 students now. I don't think they'll fall backwards. I think they'll continue to grow. And there's a bunch of people for whom they said online is terrible. I never want to do that again. I want to be with my friends learning in a classroom environment. And I think that is also true out of this narrative. And so that's sort of some of the tricky things about talking about the pandemic is I think colleges did an incredibly impressive job. And it's also at the same time true that there are a lot of disgruntled people out of it. And we saw a lot fewer going to college. The numbers that have gone to college in the last couple of years or have taken time off, dropped out, whatever it may be, has just plunged in a way that I don't think we've seen in the last 50 plus years in post-secondary education. And so it has pulled forward, I think, a lot of the trends I described in place before, but it accelerated them. And perhaps, I don't know if it smoothed the ground for the demographic declines that are coming in 2025, or that's going to be yet another shock on top of a shock. But it certainly withdrew a lot of students from post-secondary education much quicker than we expected. I'll just name two other things, Jim, that I think that are interesting. While that happened, though, the increase in short form programs and micro-credentials just exploded. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it's like 70% increase in terms of micro-credentials. So you saw higher ed shrinking by over 1 million students since the pandemic, and short form non-accredited programs increasing 70%. That I think is really interesting. So it suggests people wanted education and upskilling, but they didn't think traditional higher ed was where to get it. And I just think that's a really important piece to hold on to. The second one is federal dollars came out really as emergency relief funds so that institutions did not go under during this. This wasn't unique to post-secondary. It was through much of the economy, but colleges and universities certainly benefited from it. And so I think a lot of us said, well, a lot of colleges and universities might go belly up during the pandemic. Has not happened. I think that's largely in part because of the federal relief dollars that came through. Those are drying up right now. Will we see a return to what was looking like a steady increase of colleges closing or merging before the pandemic, starting in 2023, really 2024, leading up into that demographic decline that really starts in 25?
Got it. Now, when you say short form, can you explain all that encompasses?
Yeah, it's a pretty wide-ranging set of credentials, right? This could be boot camps. It could be Google IT certificates. It could be Microsoft IT certificates. It's micro bachelors and micro masters from edX. It's all of these things. And basically that 70% or whatever figure it is came from Credly, which is a company in the space that essentially verifies these short form certificates and helps represent to employers that indeed, Jim and Michael did take these courses, they did pass these assessments, and therefore they have these skills and certifications, and we can give it to, we can port it over to you so that you can verify that they in fact did this learning. So that's where that stat comes from. I will tell you, with my Guild education hat on that I was wearing during much of the pandemic, we saw the demand for short form courses in our course catalog. So Guild does not offer education itself. It partners with a variety of partners, both traditional higher ed institutions, as well as boot camps and short form course providers and English language training apps and things like that to offer education and upskilling. We saw the demand for short form courses, sub 13 weeks, just spike during the pandemic, really shifted, I think, what Guild was known for in many cases. Guild was really thought of, I think, beforehand as where you're a post-secondary degree completer, sort of a benefit provider, if you will. And that's not really what Guild looks like anymore. It's much more around skills and helping people move forward in their careers and career mobility. And a large part of that is because individuals and companies realized these shorter certificates or more tailored for their immediate workforce needs.
Got it. Now, where does the master classes of the world or world book classes, things like that, fall into that spectrum, or do they not?
I love the masterclass question. I think of if for an interesting reason, right? I think of masterclass as like some of the coolest edutainment that is out there in the world. I don't know that it's going to help you get those skills you need to progress, but it's a really cool way to learn about a new field. To maybe, you want to learn about gardening for your own home life, right? Like they have some of the coolest content out there. You're interested in dancing or singing or playing tennis, like who better than to learn from Serena Williams, right? But taking a master class is not going to make you an expert tennis player, is the way I think about it. So it's sort of learning about, it's extremely entertaining, incredible stories, incredible videography, and high quality production. What I think is interesting is what was birthed then from masterclass, which is one of the co-founders, Aaron Rasmussen, started outlier.org. And that is to do these gen ed courses basically for $400 totally, with the same high production value techniques that masterclass used, plus a lot more active learning. So the reason I sort of put masterclass in the edutainment category is it's not incredibly active. You can ride your Peloton, right, and take a masterclass, and it's sort of like podcasts, right? It's informative and it is learning, but it's not going to make you a master in something. Outlier.org, I think, is something different. It takes some of those techniques around engagement, but pairs them with the learning sciences around active learning, engagement with faculty and experts, so that you're doing projects and getting feedback on performance and things of that nature. You have tutors and stuff like that. So taking all that research and putting it into a really neat package that helps would-be college students get their first gen ed requirements from a much more affordable source, and then transfer in to a 4-year institution. So it is interesting. I think some of these downstream innovations that have come from things like a master class that I think could be transformational. You also, on the other end, have mobile learning experiences like the Quantic School of Business and Technology, for example, or Duolingo for language learning, or Learn to Win that a lot of sports teams in the Department of Defense are using for training. These sort of mobile first learning providers are taking advantage of the extensive research around the benefits of active learning, where basically every 7-8 seconds, you're answering a question, you're engaging, you're leaning forward. And the research is pretty clear. When you're actually doing work, that's how learning actually occurs and is more durable.
Got it. And so those are some of the innovations that have happened during the pandemic, right? You spoke about some campuses are online and have scaled and have done a really good job, and then some have stayed in person. And then there's hybrid and best practices. And what can we learn from that? Is there hope that, there is some models that really are refined and are the future of education for higher ed for most folks?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jim, because students clearly liked the flexibility that hybrid gave them, the ability to go in person sometimes, the ability to learn off campus and be anywhere on campus, or frankly around the world. In some cases, they liked that flexibility. What I'm hearing from a lot of students is they want to continue that flexibility. What I'm hearing from institutions, on the other hand, is something a little bit different. The Northeasterns of the world are saying, absolutely, we can do really cool things with hybrid learning, and we're going to lean into this and play it up really to give students what they want, but create a really cool active learning experience. More institutions are like Georgia Tech or Emory or UCLA that I've talked to, where they're saying, it's a lot of work on faculty, and we kind of think it's a subpar experience for everyone, because the faculty member can really only pay attention to one or the other. We'd rather take some of the techniques that they learned from the virtual experience and bring them into the classroom around, these back chats or using TAs to create conversation and things of that nature. That we think is interesting, but we don't really want to support a simultaneous, synchronous, hybrid virtual and in-person experience, right? Like that is not something we're interested in, except maybe in lecture classes. That's the one exception where I think you may continue to see hybrid. It was growing before the pandemic, frankly, and it doesn't really matter where you are for a lecture, so because you're not participating. So that I think you might see the continuation of it. My own instinct is that writ large across higher ed, the UCLA, Georgia Tech, Emory side of the argument is going to carry more weight, because that's my observation as well, is that it's a lot of work on faculty and it creates a subpar experience for both. And one where those who are virtual sort of say like, why am I being treated as a second class citizen in some ways? And the experience isn't all that good. And I know they're saying they want the flexibility. I'm not sure that's what the flexibility they have in mind. Now, the one thing I will point to, Jim, that I think is maybe more promising around a hybrid-like experience is what Minerva University is doing, where I'm on the board of the university. But in effect, these are students who live together in 7 cities around the world. So they're co-located, but their classes themselves are online. And they're in what they call Forum, which is their platform they use to facilitate active learning seminars. And the students learn online in these seminars where they are constantly participating, debating each other, breaking out into small groups, coming back, voting on questions, like constant participation in what's an incredible learning experience. I will say an exhausting one as well. But then they're really using the community as the place to gather for the projects that they do together or the labs that they do and things of that nature. And I think that's a more promising version of hybrid in the long run, is use the online learning for the instruction component, if you will, right? And use the community and the facilities for those hands-on team-based projects and things of that nature.
Got it. And that'll be interesting to watch as these things develop, right? As these upstarts scale, right? And the schools adapt, right?
Yep. And I was going to say, we'll be back in 2 years from now with a totally different narrative. So yeah.
So we've just been through the pandemic. Students from all ages, all grades have had challenges, right? I know my kids, I'm sure your kids, but older kids as well, right? The rates of mental health issues have skyrocketed, as has, apathy and things like that. So talk to us about what we've seen and if there's anything we should be looking out for, any new innovations that are helping sort of address this issue that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I asked Chancellor Block at UCLA this question as well, sort of with the question of, is this a temporary blip or is this with us to stay? And his take was that in past pandemics, these generational effects are really with us for a while. They have long-lasting implications. And mental health challenges was on the rise before the pandemic. This isn't a new phenomenon. It just greatly accelerated it. A lot of the loneliness and apathy that you described got pulled forward in a way that was much more significant. And we've seen a lot of struggles that are real. Before the pandemic, institutions like Georgetown, I think, were on the forefront of thinking about how do we create more proactive forms of mental health support that are not hotlines, right? Where students are, when they're on the brink of a disaster, they're going to the university health services with the challenge, but more, how do we get in front of it and create a web of support and resourcefulness for students on the front end? I think more leaning into that is going to be critical. What I heard from when we did our Future You podcast in Atlanta from some of the faculty members at Georgia Tech and Emory, they were talking a lot about how in their mind, we need to create students who are hardier and more durable and really not think of the university as the parent, but really equipping students with the hardiness and perseverance and grit, et cetera, skills that enable them to cope in an increasingly chaotic and complicated world. And I think that's going to be a piece of this as well. And I don't think that's just going to be a solution that is bolted on to the existing schools. I think those schools that do this well will make that a core part of their classes and teaching and learning. Easier said than done, but I think that's the way you're going to have to go if you want to make this durable and a sustainable part of your campus for these students. And then I guess the third part is there is a technology add-on solution, I think, as well, which is, we've seen obviously the rise of remote healthcare services, right? Teletherapy. And I think for that on-demand support, this could be a very promising path for many individuals to get more support, and for colleges to more flexibly and fluidly provide support as needed. And that also will allow them, frankly, to do it in partnership with companies or a range of other institutions, rather than them having to stand up their university health services wings and just, double, triple, quadruple it and have all those people on as a fixed cost, as opposed to vary it with the rates of need and incidence within their community. So I really think it's going to take this three-part response of intentionality from institutions to tackle it. But I also don't think it's going to be an easy set of answers. I think it's going to be with us for a while, and we're going to have to invest in what universities do well. I guess this is the fourth part of the stool, which is we don't talk enough about the role of research and the incredible contribution universities make to our knowledge base. To have universities leaning in and researching on the best way to work with individuals who need mental health support and take it seriously, I think is going to be crucial in the years ahead as well.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that. I mean, there's got to be sort of I wonder if an approach might be to partner with one of these tech companies or these online apps that help with mental health issues. Maybe just have checkups with every student, right? So there's no stigma. Every student has check-ins twice a year or 4 times a year, whatever it is, to make them feel comfortable with it and address any issues early rather than later, and they become really problematic.
Yeah, I love that idea, Jim. And I think it actually echoes what we're learning from the field of functional medicine in healthcare, which is the notion of pairing your doctor with a health coach who has 3, 4, 5 times a year regular check-ins with you, regardless, to say, are you keeping up with the stuff that we talked about at your once a year appointment? Are you in fact doing the behavior change? Because we know healthcare is not just about popping pills. It's really about lifestyle and decisions you make around fitness and sleep and nutrition and all these things that have huge impact on mental health as well. Building routines, of how you tackle the schoolwork in front of you and stuff like that. This is a really holistic response. It's why I think the idea is a smart one, A, to take away the stigma and make it a regular checkup. But B, I think it's why it's going to touch all parts of the university life. And I know, again, at Minerva, from a trustee perspective, we want to educate our students a lot on the practices around sleep and nutrition and balance and things of that nature, so that they are equipped to deal with these challenges, not just for the 4 years, or some places it's 6 or 8 years, right, that they're with you in the university community, but really throughout their lives, that they have the tools to be able to help themselves and get the help that they need.
Right. And, actually, as you talk about it, clearly those can be extended relatively easy after they even graduate, right? Again, that's entry level, that transition piece where they need a lot of coaching, not only mental health, but coaching in general, right? To get them sort of transitioned could be really helpful, and a lifelong package, right? To help them stay engaged.
Isn't that interesting? Actually, I hadn't thought about that before, but there's a lot of speculation right now in higher ed around subscription models for lifelong learning, replacing fundraising and things of that nature, a much deeper relationship. Because if it's true that you need to upskill and reskill every 3 to 4 years, why not do it at a trusted partner like your university where you got your degree and have that lifelong relationship? I think that sounds nice in theory, but it's been hard to put in place in practice. I wonder if actually health and mental health specifically, for those institutions, if maybe that's the gateway to establishing a trusting, ongoing relationship that is supportive with individuals. And frankly is not every 3 to 4 years, but is quarterly, right? And I wonder if the universities don't have to stand up that service. It can white label from a company, but the university maybe is your front door, your trusted front door into providing that and thinking about you more holistically. And by the way, connecting you to new research that will impact your lifestyle choices throughout your life as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Clearly, that could be, as you say, a gateway, right? And a connector, especially during those post few years where there's invariably a drop off of connection when people are on their way and don't really think about looking back, right?
No, I mean, that's where we lose people, and universities are obviously looking for new revenue streams. So on their side, let's just talk about the selfish side, to develop ways that they can add value to students. And frankly, actually, in a place, as we're spinning this out, I'm liking this idea more and more. Universities are really emphatic. We are not your transactional players, right? Like if you want that one-off skill, go ahead, go sign up for the Coursera course to get your Google IT certificate. We're much more about developing the whole individual. And this, I think, is fitting, right, with that value proposition in a more comprehensive, holistic way.
Right. And let's talk about that. You mentioned subscription. There's been talk about tokenization, NFTs relating to education. I've been really fascinated by it, frankly. I think there's a lot of potential, a lot of hype as well. But what's your take on that whole sort of opportunity or approach?
I think it's still looking for a really good use case, is what I would say. This world of blockchain and decentralized, right, granting of permissions around various things you might do. What I think we see right now is people said, well, clearly, like the Credly use case, right, verifying attainment of degrees and certificates, that will be an obvious place for these sorts of vehicles to play a role. What we see in practice is these companies have that functionality, and well under 10% of employers or individuals take advantage of them. It's just not, it's not clear why I need that much trust from my university for me as an individual, right, to represent that I have this. Where I think it could change, and I want to keep an eye on, is as we distribute the ways we assess mastery of skills, might there be a role for the blockchain in that? So I'll give you an example. Khan Academy during the pandemic stood up a thing called schoolhouse.world. It's a tutoring site, but the way they get their tutors is to verify that, Jim, you have mastery in entrepreneurship, say, right? And so you do a set of performance tasks that other people who've been verified for having mastery on this watch the video of you performing the task and say, yep, based on this rubric, all four of us agree Jim has this, therefore he's now a master. He's able to tutor on this topic. The interesting thing is that then creates actually not just a tutoring platform, but it creates a way to do mastery certification along a whole range of skills that you can develop. And it doesn't have to be centralized like ETS creating individual test items, right? It can be much more decentralized. Well, under that scenario, I wonder, could blockchain play an interesting role of trusted authority, right? Who can actually say, yes, I in fact have mastered these skills. I am able to assess other people who have these, and it shows that then I have earned them, right, in some sort of way. And so that, I think, is a really interesting use case that I want to keep a close eye on as we get more and more around skills certification and mastery certification rather than degree and time-based attainment.
Got it. And are there any other trends that we should be keeping an eye out for, as we move forward here? Anything that we haven't discussed so far?
Well, we've touched on quite a bit. I guess the only other one I'll come back to is, the consolidation question of colleges, right? So I obviously said up front that there was clearly a trend growing of schools consolidating in terms of going out of business or merging. My mentor, Clayton Christensen, was famous for saying half of schools would go bankrupt. He then revised the prediction, just for the record, when we wrote about it in the New York Times, because we had a conversation about how bankruptcy doesn't really occur in higher ed for some reasons relating to federal financial aid, and closing and mergers are much more popular than what's called financial exigency in higher education. And we said that we thought at least 25% of institutions would consolidate over the next 2 decades or have financial exigency declarations. So we're sort of, I guess, 9 years now into that prediction. So we've got another 11 to go. I'll tell you, I think it was speeding up along the projection. And then, as I said, it slowed down. But I think it's going to accelerate again once we hit 2025. And we know that there's a pretty big trough of demographics through at least 2033, which is when the prediction sort of plays itself out. With the federal relief dollars drying up, with tuition continuing to go up and so many choosing not to go to college, so many asking the question, what is the value of college right now? We could have a separate debate around what is the value, but like this is what people are asking in the water. There's a lot of questions around that. Employers are starting to stop requiring degrees for entry-level roles in some cases. Will they start sorting according to that as well? Open question to be determined. And all these disruptive new delivery ways of education, I think, are interesting in terms of earn and learn models, apprenticeships, boot camps, and the like. I think it could be a very different landscape 10 years from now. This isn't to say that more institutions won't pop up, like the aggregate number might not be similar, or that there might not be fewer institutions serving even more students right now in post-secondary education. But I do think a large number of the existing institutions will struggle and consolidate over the next 10 years.
Got it. And that's obviously a scary reality. And, from my perspective, those communities and those economies around all those hundreds, if not over 1,000 universities, ultimately, and we saw in the pandemic, right? When those campuses closed, the impact was really devastating.
Seismic.
The domino effect of all the services, all the businesses that feed off a community.
Well, I think this is the right topic, right, for us to think about, because I almost say, this is reality. The financial challenges are what they are, right? The broken business model is what it is. We know that 40% of institutions are under 1,000 students. So right away, these tend to be tuition-dependent institutions that are probably struggling. A large percentage of those are in these exurban rural communities where they are the employer, they are the economic activity in town. That, I think, is where the displacement and dislocation that could have serious ripple effects for society are worth thinking about. And what do we do about that? My sense is the urban environments probably be okay, but I think it's more those exurban and rural places where there's not a clear brand, but there's a high price tag. Those communities, I think your question is right on. I don't know that we'll miss the research from those particular institutions that go under, but I do think we'll miss the economic activity.
Got it. Well, this has been great, Mike. I really appreciate you talking about this. This has been really informative and educational. Before we end, I wanted to ask you: is there one thing we should all know about the future of education? Per se, going forward, one thing that you want us to take away from this conversation?
I think more students are searching for real value and the progress that they are trying to make in their lives. And they want meaningful progress on that pathway. And the institutions that figure out how to align what they're doing with the clear pathways of progress are the ones that are going to thrive the most.
Great. And before we end, Michael, we usually ask for a saying or a quote or something that's meaningful to you.
Well, I have a few, but the one I say often to myself is Hakuna Matata. And I like it because when I say it, I sort of exhale and have this no worries moment from The Lion King, of course. But I think it's more around a stoicism philosophy of control what you can control, recognize what you can influence but not control, and recognize what's outside of your control, and then work on the things that you can control, and the rest, no worries, because it's going to happen the way that they do. And I think that's a message that is useful for individuals. I think it's a message that's useful for institutions as well, as they try to pivot through the complexity and constant changing of the next several years.
That's great. Great way to end this conversation. Thanks again, Michael. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.